In the brutal winter of 1875, in the frozen landscapes of Montana, Sarah Collins and her two young children survived as best they could, clinging to a hope that crumbled like damp wood in the fireplace. The cabin that was once the shared dream with her late husband, William, was now a deteriorating shell that barely protected them from the cutting wind. One night, when the storm raged as if the sky itself were collapsing, a knock at the door interrupted their resigned silence. Sarah hesitated for a moment. No one traveled in these conditions. When she opened it, she discovered the unthinkable. A staggering stranger, well-dressed but soaked in blood, an unknown cowboy barely conscious, with bullet wounds staining his dark coat crimson. Sarah had only some hard bread, a thin stew, and an iron determination, but her heart, hardened by loss, was not dead. Without thinking, she dragged him inside, laid him on the cot that had been William's, and began to tend to him with the last of the remedies left in her cupboard. She used herbs from her garden, wood, heated water, and a rag that had once been part of her wedding dress. She fed him the last portion of stew, the same she had saved for the children. That decision, which seemed like a mere act of compassion, would mark the turning point that transformed the destiny of her entire family. Who was this stranger? And why did his arrival on the darkest night seem written by a force beyond logic? Hours before the storm, Sarah had been alone in her room with the family Bible on her lap. Her finger moved slowly through the pages, dates of births, marriages, and now a new name in the death register, William Collins, 4 months since the fever had torn him from their lives. The paper still smelled of fresh ink. She closed the book carefully, as if closing the cover would also seal the pain away. She stored it in the cedar chest William had carved during their first winter together, a chest that contained more memories than provisions. From the window, she watched Emma and Thomas playing in the frost. Her children's laughter hurt her as much as the lack of bread, a reminder of everything that could be lost if she didn't find a way out. Emma, barely 10, already knew how to set a rabbit trap. Thomas, at 8, tried to fix things he barely understood. Their childhood was slipping away into adult duties. The wind seeped through the loose planks of the cabin, and in every whistle, Sarah heard the promises William never got to fulfill, that he would teach Thomas to care for the livestock, to sow wheat, to defend their home. But now there was neither enough strength nor time. The wheat field, once the family's pride, was half sown. The fence was in pieces. Only 3 cows and a sick calf remained. The stable roof was about to give in under the weight of the next snowfall. Sarah had sold everything she could. First William's tools, then his horse, and finally the tea set her mother had left her. Yesterday, Mr. Hankins from the bank had come to remind her of what she already knew. 3 months, he said with a look that didn't match his polite tone. 3 months to settle the debt or face eviction. And just when everything seemed lost, the storm brought that dying cowboy. The bank had been patient, more than Sarah expected given the circumstances. But even compassion has limits when it comes to numbers and payment dates. The mortgage can't be extended further, Hankins had said in that tone that feigned understanding, though his papers told another story. That morning, Sarah heated water on the wood stove for porridge. The last grains of oats were stretched with dried apple pieces, a recipe from better times that now served more as an illusion of abundance. Emma came in with her hands red from the cold, carrying a small bowl. "Only 3 eggs today, Mama," she reported with a seriousness that didn't match her 10 years. "But they're good." "That's wonderful, honey," Sarah replied, forcing a smile, not because she believed what she said, but because Emma needed to see it in her eyes. 3 eggs, 3 mouths. The calculation hurt, but no more than seeing her daughter carrying the weight of a farm that wasn't hers. "Can you call Thomas? Breakfast is almost ready." Emma nodded and went out while Sarah divided the 3 plates with precision. It wasn't just food, it was strategy. The children would get more, she would take just enough to avoid fainting. She had learned to ignore hunger like one learns to ignore the cold, accepting it. Minutes later, Thomas burst in with the energy of someone who still believes the world can be fixed with good intentions. He was carrying a pile of firewood wrapped in a blanket. "Mama, look, I found dry wood under the big oak. It's still good." His eyes shone with that fire she once saw in William when he spoke of the future. The image was an unexpected blow to Sarah's chest. "Good work, my brave one," she said, ruffling his hair. As he passed by her, she noticed the sleeves of his shirt barely covered his arms. They would need new clothes before next winter, but that was a problem for another day. As they ate breakfast, Emma put down her spoon and said in a firm voice, "Mrs. Peterson at the church offered to pay me if I help her with her sewing. I could go after my chores." Sarah paused for a moment, her children working for pennies, taking on tasks that weren't theirs. It hurt, but in times like these, pride didn't feed anyone. "How kind of her," she replied with a controlled voice. "Just don't neglect your studies." That was the line she wouldn't cross. Education, William used to repeat, was their most valuable inheritance. Reading, writing, arithmetic, that couldn't be lacking, even if everything else fell apart. After breakfast, she watched her children walk down the dusty path toward the little wooden schoolhouse, a kilometer to the south. Broken boots, patched clothes, the biting cold, and yet they walked tall, because that too is taught dignity regardless of circumstances. Alone, Sarah rested her hands on the rough table. For a moment she let her armor fall. The tears, which she refused every day, found a crack today to escape through. How am I supposed to do this without you, William? She whispered. The question floated in the air without an answer, just like all the others since the day he died. But staying there wasn't an option. There was wood to chop, clothes to mend, and a badly wounded stranger sleeping under her roof. 3 months, that was the time the bank had given them. 3 months to gather the impossible. 3 months to work a miracle or lose everything. Sarah, her face washed by tears that could no longer wait for permission, tied her apron firmly and went out into the cold. There was no room for sadness when there was work to be done. Her children needed to see her strong, even if inside she was falling apart. The storm arrived just before nightfall. The wind howled with fury, shaking the cabin's shutters as if trying to tear them off. Sarah had just put away the last vegetables the garden had given them that day, 3 turnips and some winter squash. It wasn't much, but these days nothing was little. Then she heard Thomas shout from outside, "Mama, Mama, come quick." And in his voice was something new, something Sarah had never heard from him: fear. She grabbed her shawl and went out, letting the wind lash her face as she ran toward where the shout called her near the unsown field. Emma was already there, motionless, as if sculpted from stone. And then Sarah saw him, a man lying in the mud, his shirt soaked in blood, beside him a huge black horse, lifeless. The animal carried a richly decorated saddle with dull Mexican silver spurs under the fading light. Strangers' clothes spoke of wealth, a fine wool coat, leather boots that could cost more than Sarah's entire harvest. But money doesn't heal wounds, especially not when the blood is already mixing with the frozen Montana earth. "He's still breathing, Mama," Emma whispered, her eyes fixed on him. Sarah felt the weight of the decision like a stone in her chest. They had no resources, barely food, almost no medicine, but they also didn't have the luxury of abandoning a man to die. "Thomas, go stoke the fire." "Emma, help me." She knelt in the mud, her fingers searching for the man's pulse. It was there, weak, trembling like a wounded bird. They turned him with effort. He was heavy, muscular. The blood plastered his hair to his skull, and his side showed a blackened hole. "This wasn't a farm accident. What do you think happened to him?" Emma asked as they both dragged him toward the cabin. "Nothing good," Sarah replied without hesitation. "They managed to get him inside, though every step was a struggle." Sarah felt her back creak with each pull, but she didn't stop. Thomas already had the fire roaring. Emma ran for the herb box, Thomas for rags and clean water. As she cut the man's shirt, Sarah saw the wound, ugly but not mortal. The bullet had gone through. She knew these wounds. During the war, her farm had been an impromptu hospital. She knew how to treat it, but something else caught her attention. Other old scars, some from bullets, others from knives. Body was a map of violence, and yet there, hanging from his vest, was a fine silver pocket watch stained with blood. She opened it carefully. Inside, an inscription: "For J.W. with eternal love, Margaret." This man had been loved once. Through the night they worked tirelessly. Emma was an impeccable helper. She changed the cloths, prepared poultices with what was left of the herbs. Thomas kept the fire alive and watched through the window, though he didn't know what he was looking for. The man was delirious. "Margaret, forgive me," he whispered between feverish gasps. "The papers in the saddle have to disappear." Sarah soothed him with a cool cloth. "You're safe now," she repeated, not knowing if he heard her. By dawn, the fever broke. Sarah, exhausted, sent the children to sleep. Their faces showed more worry than sleepiness, but they obeyed. She stayed, watching the rhythm of his breathing. She wondered again and again, who was he? What was he doing so badly wounded near a farm forgotten by the world? When the sun finally streamed through the window, the man's eyes opened. Blue, clear, intelligent, they settled on her. At first only confusion, then something more. "You saved my life," he said in a hoarse voice. Sarah nodded, suddenly uncomfortable with her appearance and the evident poverty surrounding them. "Rest, the questions can wait," she said, trying to get up. He took her hand. His grip was firm. "Thank you," he whispered, and closed his eyes again, this time in natural sleep. Sarah looked at him a moment longer with something stirring in her chest. A premonition, a strange intuition. Nothing would be the same after that night. Sarah, her hand still on the bandage, paused for a second. The stranger's words had just pierced the armor she had been building since William's death. "Thank you," he said. "They're good kids. They've had to grow up too fast," she replied, lowering her gaze for a moment. James nodded. He understood. He didn't need more explanations. He observed the cabin like someone reading between the lines. He didn't just see old walls, but years of struggle etched into every crack. "Times are hard," he murmured, almost as a shared confession. Sarah answered more quickly than she intended. "We manage," and immediately, with a tinge of pride that was more defense than truth, she added, "We're not looking for charity, mister." She left the phrase hanging like a loose lasso. He held her gaze. A barely perceptible smile formed on his lips. "Harrison." "James Harrison." He paused. Something in his expression changed, as if he were carefully weighing what he should or shouldn't say next. "And I would never dare offer charity, Mrs. Collins, but I believe in paying my debts." That phrase wasn't courtesy, it was a promise. And his tone, deep but restrained, made Sarah look at him more closely. It wasn't what he said, it was what he didn't say. And for the first time, she had the clear feeling that this man had noticed everything. The poverty disguised with cleanliness, the patched clothes, the desperation hidden behind a rigid routine. She was about to respond when Emma burst into the cabin, gasping. "Mama, Ryder is coming." The name felt like a slap, and in her voice was something more than urgency, fear. Sarah's heart jumped in her chest, but James was already moving. The sick man disappeared. In his place appeared the man who had survived bullets and ambushes. Hide the children behind the cellar door. He ordered in a firm voice, though he still trembled inside. If they ask, you haven't seen anyone. Sarah helped him up. Questions crowded in her throat. Who was Ryder? Why were they chasing him? What had James done to inspire that fear? But there was no time. The sound of hooves approached. 3 riders. Sarah pushed Emma and Thomas behind the false panel of the root cellar, put a finger to her lips, and closed the hatch. She took a deep breath, smoothed her apron, and opened the door just as the strangers stopped in front of the cabin. They needed no introduction. Dust covered their traveling clothes, but the leader's eyes were as clean as they were dangerous. Cold, calculating, a dusty hat, a revolver in plain sight, and a scar that crossed his cheek like a sinister signature. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said in a polite tone but laden with threat. "We're looking for a friend, tall man, well-dressed. Maybe he passed through here." Sarah looked at him without blinking. She couldn't tremble. She couldn't hesitate. "We haven't seen anyone like that," she said calmly. "Not many people come through here." The man narrowed his eyes, evaluating her like a hunter who suspects the prey is near. There was something in his gaze that wasn't seeking the truth, but a crack, a single crack, and he would slip in like a knife. Behind the scarred man, his companions looked at the property with calculating eyes. They weren't there for courtesy. They were hunting. "Would you mind if we took a look, just to be thorough?" he said, feigning politeness. Sarah didn't waver. "Yes, I would mind," she replied, and in her voice came something firmer than fear, determination. "My children are inside, and I won't allow strangers to surround them." She held his gaze without flinching. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." The silence between them grew dense, but she was the one who didn't back down. Finally, the riders tugged at the reins, turned around, and only when they were specks on the horizon did Sarah close the door and lean against it, trembling. What kind of man was she harboring, and what had she gotten her family into? That night when the children were asleep, Sarah approached James with a cup of willow bark tea and questions that could no longer wait. He was reclined on the blanket that served as a bed. Despite his exhaustion, his face showed more color, and the look he gave her when he accepted the tea was clear, grateful. "Those men," Sarah began in a low voice. "They weren't your friends, were they?" "No, ma'am," James replied with calm, "and I thank you for not betraying me. I know lying like that must have cost you." Sarah sat in the chair that had been William's. Her fingers moved over the wooden arms, tracing the marks of the years. "I didn't lie, exactly. I haven't seen the friend they were looking for, only a wounded man who needed help." James let out a slight smile. "You have a special talent with words, Mrs. Collins." Then with a deliberate gesture, he pulled a folded document from his coat and extended it towards her. "I think it's time you knew who you're protecting." Sarah unrolled the paper. It was a property title, not just any property. The name at the top quickened her pulse. "Double H Ranch, James William Harrison," he read in a low voice. The DH, she knew it by name, as everyone in the territory did, one of the largest, most prosperous ranches, and its owner, an enigma wrapped in rumors. "Yes, it's mine," James replied in a sober tone, "and those men work for Marcus Blackwood, though they'd never admit it. Blackwood has been trying to take my land for years, by fair means or foul. This time he chose bullets." His hand brushed the wound on his side. Sarah now understood the loose ends, the expensive clothes, the magnificent horse, the posture of someone used to being obeyed. "And why are you telling me all this?" she asked, still processing. "Because you and your children risked everything to help a stranger. You deserve to know what you're up against, and you also deserve to know that I have the means to protect you from any consequences of that generosity." Sarah straightened her back. "We didn't do it for money, Mr. Harrison." "James, please," he corrected. "And I know you didn't do it for a reward. That's precisely why I want to help." At that moment, Thomas appeared in the doorway with his hair tousled, hugging his old wooden horse. "Mama, I heard voices." Sarah got up to take him back to bed, but James spoke first. "Come here, young man." Thomas cautiously approached. James reached into his coat again. This time he pulled out a small, hand-carved wooden horse with details so fine you could even see its flowing mane. "I've been working on this while I recovered. It helped me not go crazy. What do you think?" Thomas's eyes lit up. "It looks like your horse," he exclaimed. "The one," his voice trailed off, remembering the noble Midnight. "Yes, it does. He was a good friend." James showed him how the legs moved on joints. "Every good horse needs a good owner to take care of it. Can you do that?" Thomas nodded solemnly, clutching both horses like treasures. "Thank you, Mr. James," he said, smiling sincerely. "I'll take good care of it." After taking the boy back to bed, Sarah returned and found James pensive. "He's a good kid," he commented. "Reminds me of myself at that age." He paused. His eyes drifted into the distance. "Before I learned that the world isn't always kind to dreamers." He shifted with a slight wince of pain. "But your children still have that light despite everything, and that's thanks to you." Sarah felt her cheeks flush. "Sarah, call me Sarah." "Yes, and I'll call you James." He smiled, and for a moment she no longer saw the wealthy rancher, but the man who had lost as much as she had. "Tomorrow, if I'm strong enough, I could teach Thomas how to carve wood, if that's all right with you." Sarah smiled back. "I think he'd love that." Neither mentioned the property title that still lay between them, nor the possible return of the men, nor the danger that still lurked. For now, that moment of silence was enough, warm like a slow-burning fire where trust was beginning to be born. The following days brought a new routine. James, now stronger, spent mornings teaching Thomas to carve, afternoons listening to Emma read, nights telling stories that kept the children fascinated. But in the quiet hours, Sarah saw more. One day, while the children were at school, she found him standing by the window. In his hands was an old photograph, a young woman, beautiful, smiling, her hand on the shoulder of a younger James. "Margaret," he said without turning. "My wife." Sarah put aside her sewing. The silence in his voice said more than words. She died 8 years ago, fever. She also lost the baby we were expecting. His fingers traced the edges of the portrait. I built the double H for her. I wanted a place to raise a family, grow old together, but when I finished it, she was gone. Sadness floated between them like golden dust in the light. Sarah now understood why James lived alone, because his gaze sometimes drifted toward horizons that no longer existed. "William," she said, returning the gesture, "my husband. He built this cabin with his own hands. He said every nail was a promise of our future." James settled into the chair across from Sarah. He moved with more ease now. His wound was starting to heal. "So how did you meet him?" he asked with genuine interest. "At a barn raising," she said, a smile forming on its own as she remembered. "He was the only one who didn't treat me like I was made of glass just because I was the pastor's daughter. The first thing he said to me was, 'Those hands know honest work.'" "A wise man, no doubt," James commented, also smiling. Sarah resumed her sewing. The movement was almost meditative. "The children have so much of him. Emma has his willpower, Thomas his gentleness. Every day I see parts of William in them. They're extraordinary," James affirmed. "The way they help you without complaining, facing what no child should. That reminds me that there are many ways to be strong." Sarah stopped sewing for a moment. "Sometimes I worry it's too much for them. They should be playing, shouldn't they?" She gestured around them toward the evident poverty. "They do play," James said softly. "I've seen them, but they also understand what matters. Family, effort, the value of protecting what you love. There are adults who never learn that." Their eyes met, and in that moment, without grand words, they recognized each other, not as a widow and a stranger, but as two souls who had lost, resisted, and yet still loved in silence. The moment broke when the children returned from school. Their laughter filled the air as if dragging light behind them after a cloudy day. Emma entered first, waving a sheet of paper enthusiastically. "James, the teacher said my arithmetic was perfect today." James suddenly seemed like someone else, warmer, happier. "Really? Well, that deserves a proper celebration. How about I teach you how to calculate cattle percentages? Every good rancher needs to know his numbers." Emma sat beside him while Thomas watched with interest. Sarah observed them. There was no condescension in how James treated the children, nor empty praise, only genuine interest and the kind guidance of someone who knew the value of listening. That night, when silence returned to the cabin, Sarah found James on the porch. He was looking at the stars. The wound was closing, and that could only mean one thing. Soon he would leave. The thought hurt more than she wanted to admit. "I've been alone at the H for so long," he said without turning his head. "I forgot what it was like to have a family nearby." He turned toward her. His face, lit by the moon, showed something raw, unmasked. "Thank you for reminding me." Sarah wanted to speak of her own loneliness, of how her house had started breathing again since he was in it, but the words didn't come. She just nodded. The shared silence was enough. In the distance, a coyote howled. The sound pierced the prairie like a letter without a recipient and settled in both their hearts. The morning James announced he was ready to leave was strangely gray. He had gotten a horse from a neighbor. Thomas had gone to ask for it the previous afternoon. James no longer looked like a wounded man. He was again the man from the H, firm, upright, in control of himself. On the table, he left a thick envelope. "Before I go," he said, "there's something we need to discuss." "James," Sarah replied, looking at him cautiously. "Please," he said, pointing to the chair across from him, "just listen." Emma and Thomas were in the doorway, restless. James gave them a kind smile. "Kids, can you give us a moment?" They went reluctantly, though Sarah knew they wouldn't be far. James pushed the envelope toward her. "It's a notice from the bank. Your mortgage is paid off." The world paused for an instant. Sarah brought her hand to her chest. "You had no right to do that." "Maybe not," James admitted, raising a hand, "but I had the means and I had the will. They won't threaten you with losing this house again." She felt tears welling up, relief, anger, pride all at once. "We can't accept it." "Yes, you can and you will." James's voice was low but firm. He wasn't trying to impose, he was trying to protect. "It's not charity, Sarah," James said, his gaze more intense than ever. "It's an investment in people who showed extraordinary kindness to a stranger." But he wasn't finished. He reached into his coat and pulled out another document. "The H needs real people, honest people. I'm offering something more than gratitude, a partnership, so to speak." Sarah, with trembling hands, took the paper. It wasn't a thank you letter, it was a carefully drafted contract. It explained a proposal to establish a cattle breeding operation on her own land, not as employees, but as partners. "Your property has excellent pasture," James explained. "With some improvements, a new barn, proper fencing, good stock can be productive again. The kids could continue studying, of course, but if they wanted, they could also learn the ranch business." He paused. He studied her face. "You would have a fair salary and a percentage of the profits." Sarah didn't know what to say. Her mind was racing 1,000 miles an hour. Why, she finally managed to ask. "Because in the week I spent here, I saw more dignity, more real strength than in years of business." Your children are brilliant, you are capable, and the double H would do well with you on board. Then James took a small key from his vest. There's a safe in my saddlebag. Could you ask Thomas to bring it? The boy soon returned with the box. James opened it. Inside, perfectly organized bills and several documents. This is an advance on your salary, enough to start the improvements your property needs. And these, he pointed to the papers, are recommendations from my associates in town. The general store, the hardware store, the lumberyard, they'll extend credit on my account. Sarah felt her pride and reality collide like two trains. The offer was generous, it would change her life. But I won't owe any man anything, she said firmly. James wasn't offended. He smiled calmly. And I don't expect you to. This is a fair deal, Sarah. Pure business. You'll work for everything you receive. Review the contract with a lawyer if you prefer. I'll respect whatever decision you make. Emma, who had been listening from the doorway, couldn't hold back any longer. Does that mean we can fix the barn? James turned to her with a warm smile. If your mother agrees, yes, and maybe add some horses for you and Thomas to learn. Thomas appeared beside his sister, eyes wide. Horses, really, Thomas? Sarah began in a motherly tone, but James raised a hand. Let him dream a little, Sarah. He looked at her with seriousness and tenderness at the same time. Sometimes dreaming is what gives us the courage to accept help when pride would rather we didn't. Sarah looked at them both, at her children, at their eyes shining with something she hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. She looked down at the papers. She thought of William, how he always said opportunities came disguised as things you don't expect. I need time to think about it, she said finally. Of course, James nodded, standing up. I'll be back in 3 days. He walked to the door, but before leaving, he stopped. Remember something, Sarah. Accepting help doesn't mean giving up. Sometimes it's just choosing another path to the same destination. After he left, Sarah sat in front of the contract, listening to the laughter and excited whispers of her children on the other side of the door and feeling the weight of something new. Hope. 3 weeks later, the architect's plans were spread across the table, blue lines on white, drawn promises. The future. Since she signed the contract, everything had changed. The new barn was already rising, smelling of fresh wood under the spring air. The men from town had come on their own accord, not for her, but for James Harrison's name. The owner of the Double H supported the project. That was enough to move hammers and commitments. Sarah watched them work from the door with her arms crossed and memories floating by. It looked so much like those days when William and she participated in community work bees, when the future seemed a fertile field and not a steep hill. It has good foundations, James said, approaching. He came every few days to supervise, but Sarah suspected he also came for other reasons. It just needed someone to see its potential, he added. News of the contract had spread quickly through the church, the store, the town's halls. The looks had changed. Some, like Mrs. Peterson's, were warm, genuine, others not so much. The banker's wife, for instance, watched her as if Sarah had betrayed a silent pact. Let them talk, James had said when she mentioned it. Those who have never known struggle are always quick to judge those who have survived it. There was something in James's voice that was not just conviction. It was the memory of someone who had also been judged before. Meanwhile, Emma and Thomas seemed completely oblivious to the town's murmurs. The only thing that mattered to them was each new development at the ranch, each promise now taking shape. When the first 2 horses arrived, gentle, trained, personally selected by James for them, the children couldn't hold back their tears. They were noble animals with calm eyes, and for Emma and Thomas they were a living dream. They spent every free minute in the corral. Under James's patient supervision, they learned what books don't teach: posture, connection, mutual respect. Back straight, Thomas, he instructed as he watched him circle on the mare. That's it, you're a natural, son. The word son slipped out effortlessly, and although James didn't seem to notice, Sarah saw how Thomas straightened a little more in the saddle, how his eyes lit up. James was filling spaces the family didn't even know were empty. Tomorrow, work starts on the foundations for the new wing, James said later, consulting the plans on the table. Each child will have their own room. Sarah ran her finger over the blue lines. It seems like too much, James. It's not, he replied with a seriousness that stopped her. Not compared to what you've given me. She looked at him, confused. James held her gaze. You reminded me what truly matters. The reason I built the Double H was never supposed to be just about profit. Before she could say more, a commotion from the corral interrupted them. Mama, Mama, I got the trot, Emma shouted, her face lit up with happiness. Very well, honey, Sarah replied, her heart overflowing. She hadn't heard that kind of joy in her voice for years. James watched Emma with a smile, then turned back to Sarah. There's something else I wanted to mention. The school board had a meeting yesterday. Sarah tensed. She remembered well the days she had to beg for understanding because she couldn't afford books. I've arranged for a community library to be established, James continued, and for a second teacher to be hired. Every child in the district deserves a decent education. All of them, Sarah asked, surprised, not just Emma and Thomas. Education elevates everyone, Sarah, James replied firmly. Your children reminded me of that. She looked at him as if seeing him anew for the first time. This man who had arrived bloody at her door was now changing not only her home but the entire community. Why are you doing all this, James? She asked quietly. He was silent for a moment. He watched the children with their horses. When Margaret died, I forgot something important, he finally said. That wealth without purpose is just a weight in your pockets. Your family reminded me what it means to build something meaningful. A shout from the barn interrupted his thoughts. The workers had raised the main beam. The stable would soon be a reality. Space for hay, saddles, tools, all planned, all accounted for. Progress, James said almost to himself, but he wasn't referring only to the structure. Sarah noticed. There was something more in his voice, something hinting at another kind of construction, an internal one. But before she could ask, Emma called him again to show off her trot. James went to her, leaving Sarah with the feeling that what was happening was not just transformation, it was rebirth. Tuesday morning brought Emma's first saddle, tooled leather, wildflowers, morning glories. Every detail was art. Emma didn't say anything at first, just ran her fingers over the design, amazed. Every good writer needs their own saddle, James explained. This one is just for you, and if you notice, the flowers were Margaret's favorites. Sarah, watching from the barn door, understood it wasn't just a gift, it was a bridge, a fragment of James's past offered as a seed for a new beginning. It's beautiful, Emma whispered, and suddenly, without warning, she hugged him. James stood still, then slowly returned the gesture. His face showed something Sarah hadn't seen in him before. Real joy mixed with a very old sorrow. Well, he said, clearing his throat, let's see how it fits on your mare. What followed were not simple riding lessons. James taught them how to approach a horse, how to read its language, how to earn its respect. Sarah was also learning. Silently from the doorway, she watched as James not only taught them to ride, but to trust in themselves, in each other, in life. Horses are like people, he said one afternoon while Thomas worked with his restless mount. If you don't approach with calm and respect, they won't give you anything. Horses feel everything, James said in a firm but patient tone. They know when you're nervous or unsure of yourself. First, you have to believe in yourself for them to believe in you too. Thomas frowned, holding the reins so tightly his knuckles were white. What if I make a mistake? He asked quietly. Then you learn, James replied, softening his posture. That's all any of us can do. He carefully corrected his hand position. Your father who was going to teach you these things, wasn't he? Thomas nodded, his eyes bright with held-back tears. He promised he'd teach me everything about the farm when I grew up. He'd be proud of you right now, James said in a low but firm voice. You're learning, you're helping your mother, you're being brave even when it's not easy. Then he stepped back, gesturing calmly to the horse. Now show me that turn again. Remember, confidence. Sarah from the fence watched as her son straightened his shoulders, letting doubt transform into determination. The horse, as if sensing it, responded with precision, executing a clean, elegant turn. That's my boy, James called out, pride in his voice. When he turned, he found Sarah watching them. No words were needed. What they were witnessing was more than a riding lesson. It was the rebuilding of an identity, a piece of childhood restored. That night, while Sarah prepared the stew, she heard Emma and James's voices from the porch. The open window let the words drift into the kitchen like a song. Emma asked with genuine interest about the Double H, how the cattle operation worked, the breeding plans. I want to learn everything, she declared. Mama says girls can do whatever they set their minds to. Your mama is a wise woman, James replied without hesitation. Some of the best ranch managers I know are women. They have a special sensitivity with animals, an attention to detail that many men don't have. Could I become a ranch manager someday with hard work and study? Of course, I'll teach you how we keep the breeding records. It's math, genealogy, observation. Everything matters if you want to build a strong herd. Sarah stirred the pot, remembering William's words about Emma. That girl has more fire in her soul than many grown men. He would have been proud to see her like this, strong, motivated, alive. The screen door creaked. Thomas joined the group, and in minutes they were animatedly discussing horse breeds. James answered every question with patience, detailing everything from hooves to temperaments. From the kitchen, Sarah listened to their laughter, their interwoven voices, their lively questions, and realized that was the sound of healing, not the absence of pain, but the emergence of a new kind of joy that could coexist with memories. James looked at her through the window. He was smiling, and in that smile was something more than gratitude. There was belonging, there was a future. Mama, Thomas shouted. James says I can help with the calves when they're born. Real ranch work. That's wonderful, honey, she replied, her voice trembling inside but steady outside. Now go wash up. Dinner is almost ready. The children ran inside. James stayed on the porch, his expression thoughtful. When Sarah approached, he murmured, they learn fast. Like their mother, she replied, feeling the blush rise to her cheeks. They've had a good teacher. In the twilight, his hand found hers, a brief touch but natural, as if it had been destined all along. We're all learning, Sarah. That's how family works. The word family hung in the air between them, not as a statement, but as a possibility, an unsigned promise. Summer gave way to autumn. The Montana sky filled with deep golds and serene blues. On the kitchen table, James unfolded a hand-drawn map. Sarah approached curiously. Your farm isn't what it used to be, he explained, pointing to the lines. Look, new fences, more pasture, the renovated barn, and here the wheat field, record yield. William would be amazed, she said, her voice barely audible. You always had the foundation, James replied. It just needed some support to raise it all up again. The harvest festival was approaching.